and welcome back to our Cael language series. Today we're going to do a little more work on our speaking skills. This will be our 8th episode in our series, and we're going to look again at the third question on the Cael test part 1. This is where you're asked to speak on a visual. Now, before we get into our practice question today, I will take about 5 minutes or so to review the checklist of skills that the raters will look at when they're going to give you a score for your speaking answers. If you're familiar with this by now, if you've seen past episodes, please feel free to skip ahead about 5 minutes or so in the video, but we will do a quick recap right now. So first of all, the raters are going to listen to your delivery skills. They're assessing how clearly you speak. So your volume and your speed will be taken into account. You need to speak loudly enough to be heard and not too fast, not too slow. You're also wanting to make sure you're pronouncing your words properly. We have to stress the words in the right places in order for your listener to fully understand what you're saying. So once those basics are covered, you'll want to next practice your rhythm and your intonation. So again, we use intonation when the voice rises and falls naturally in order to convey meaning. Last but not least, it's important to practice studying from home before you take this test to make sure that you can speak from the beginning to the end of your response with very few pauses and very few interjections. Interjections are those funny words that sometimes we make. We often say or ah or gee when we're trying to think of the next word or idea. It's okay to interject once in a while, but if you're doing this too frequently throughout your response, if you're interjecting or pausing in the middle of every sentence, for example, it's going to be frustrating for the listener. So again, practice doing this at home so that you can speak with more confidence and avoid those pauses. The next skill set that the raters will listen for on your test is for your accuracy of language. So this will involve both the transitions that you use. In other words, how well are you connecting ideas together? Are you using linking words and phrases at an academic level to do that? And the raters will also assess your actual vocabulary choice. So it's an academic test, so we definitely hope to impress the raters with higher level words and some sophistication. But the language choice that you make must be suitable for the task at hand. The words you use must be done so accurately and precisely. Hopefully you've got a nice range of vocabulary as well, so that you're not just repeating the same words or transitions throughout the response. Again, you'll impress the raters most if you've got a nice wide variety of language that you can insert. Your content is important, so of course you're going to have several main ideas that answer the question at hand, and you're also going to provide plenty of specific examples and details to back up or extend discussions around those main points. At the beginning of your response, you should be introducing the topic and again, focusing right in on the answer to the question that you're being asked on that test. Every single idea and detail that you discuss throughout your answer should be on topic. It should relate back to that question on the test itself. Hopefully the ideas are presented in a logical order, so there should be a very clear beginning, middle, and conclusion to your answer. And again, that final sentence you provide should provide this concluding remark. Oftentimes we'll either summarize the main point or sometimes even make a prediction or suggest a next step, depending on what the question itself is asking about. Now, remember your tone. This is an academic test, so the ideas should be presented using that academic language as well. So we don't want to use slang expressions and things like that. That would be considered too casual. Always try to be specific and academic. And once again, we hope that we have enough ideas to carry us through to the end of the answer without repeating the same ideas over and over. All right, pace yourself. So have the correct number of main ideas and supporting details to fill that time effectively. So speaking of time, the very last thing that the raters are going to assess is called the task fulfillment. So they're going to be looking to see how close you come to the required speaking time on the test. If you've been asked to speak for 2 minutes, for example, they're wanting to see that you're fairly close to 2 minutes. It does not have to be exact. It doesn't have to be perfect. If you finish in 1 minute and 52 seconds, for example, instead of 2 minutes, as long as the answer is very complete and well supported, that will be just fine. You won't be penalized for your score. If your answer, though, is far too short, if you speak for 1 minute instead of 2 minutes, that's going to be a problem. You're not giving the raters enough information to assess your score, I think. And likewise, too, if you're cut off in the middle of a main idea and you don't have time to fully develop that, that might also penalize your score. So again, practice at home so that you're comfortable speaking for these lengths of time, and just keep an eye on your timer at the test itself. The other part of this task fulfillment has to do with how completely you've answered the question itself. So if there were 2 parts in the question, for example, the raters want to make sure that you've offered up details of discussion on both parts. Again, so just make sure you're fully answering the question that's asked of you. Now, in the question that we're looking at today, we're going to be speaking on a visual. So part of your score actually does come from how accurately you interpret information on this chart or this graph that you'll see on the test. So you should be able to describe it, identify some general trends, and also draw some conclusions based on that information. So we're going to look at the same question that we actually addressed in last week's episode, but we're going to take a different approach. Last week, you heard a real test taker answer this question, and we talked about her score on the test, and we analyzed strengths and weaknesses. In today's episode, we're going to use the same question, but I'm going to present a step-by-step approach as to how you might gather ideas to answer this question, and we'll walk through it that way to get it ready for the test itself. So this question, by the way, will always give you 60 seconds to prepare. So you'll have that much time to at least look at the chart on the test and get familiar with what it's all about. When it comes time to record your answer, you will be speaking for 2 minutes. 2 minutes may sound like quite a long time to fill, but if you follow the instructions on the test and do everything that's asked of you, you should be able to pace yourself to fill that 2 minutes. So again, that's partly what we hope to accomplish in this episode, to give you some tips on how to do that properly. So you'll notice at the bottom of the chart, this is where your instructions fall. It tells you to describe and explain the information that you see depicted in this graph, and also to draw some conclusions. So you're technically doing 3 different things with this graph. So let's look at the first part. The very first thing you're asked to do is to describe this graph. So to describe it, you're going to provide an overview of what it is you're looking at. You're setting it up so that the listener understands fully what's to come. So looking at the graph, you will notice a little summary statement just above the title of the graph itself. So reading from this test, it says that this chart shows non-resident travelers to Canada. So at some point when you're speaking, you're going to need to introduce that idea. But we don't want to use language. We don't want to read exactly word for word from the test itself. So you're going to need to think of a way to convey that message, that this chart is showing the number of people who have visited Canada who don't actually live there. That's what we mean by non-resident. So that would probably be your very first sentence as you record your answer. Again, it just provides an introduction to the main topic of this entire chart. If you then look at the 2 axes, so there's a vertical axis that goes up and down on the left-hand side. In this case, because we're talking about the number of travelers to Canada, you'll notice that this deals with the population. So in your introduction, you can explain that this graph is looking at the number of people from 0 to 5 million even. And then the axis that goes horizontally across the bottom of this chart, you can see gives you the time frame. So again, you will introduce in your introduction here that we're looking at the years 2013 to 2016. It's really important to talk about the legend. So this is a line graph, as you can see, and we're clearly looking at how people came to Canada. So there are 3 different methods of transportation. So we're looking at the number of people who drove, flew, or sailed to the country. All right, so the the different colors there of the lines represent travel by land, by air, and by sea. So what I'd like to do next is I'm going to play a little clip, an audio clip of just this much information. We're not going to hear the full response in one go. We're going to listen just to this overview statement. You'll hear my voice actually recording the answer just as a demonstration. And what I'd like you to do, please, is as you're listening to this recording, can you please follow the notes on the screen so that you can see how these details that you're looking at in the chart itself are going to translate into complete sentences that you'll be using when you speak and record. All right, let's listen now, and hopefully you'll get some ideas. Displays the number of people who traveled to Canada from another country of residence between 2013 to 2016. This study measures the number of travelers from 0 to 5 million who drove to Canada, crossed the ocean, or flew into the country. Okay, and that's it. That's just the introduction part. All right, so here's a transcript of what you just heard recorded. Okay, so having a quick look there, I'm just going to color code those 4 details. So here we have it. The red line introduces the title of the graph itself. You can see that we've included the 2 axes. So we have the years as well as the population or the number of people that this chart is going to look at. So that represents both the blue and the green letters here that you see. And then last but not least, in purple, we're looking at the legend. So we have to convey the 3 methods of transportation that this entire graph is looking at. So this, we'll call this part 1 of your answer, of your complete answer. This is presenting an overview of the information. So set it up like this so that you'll now be ready to move on to explain. You're looking at trends here. So this is your opportunity to first, I think, provide an overall broad focus. For these types of questions, it's helpful sometimes to start with the big picture idea. So when you look at all 3 methods of transportation here, all 3 lines on this chart, you'll notice that all 3 of them do increase. Some increase more than others, but I think if we just start with that broad general statement that all 3 methods of transportation are showing an increase, that's probably the best place to start. And once you've given that overview, this is where you'll then want to get specific. So you'll want to get a lot more narrow in your focus. So you can look at the graph itself and just start reading out or interpreting the information. You can start to talk about how much some of the numbers have increased by. You can give the starting numbers and the end numbers. And that will lead you as well to discuss, which methods of transportation have the most number of visitors and which ones have the least, and so on. So you will start to do a slight comparison contrast here. You're looking for similarities in these trends, and you're also looking for how they might be a little bit different. So again, I'm going to play for you this second part. You'll hear my voice recording again, just a certain approach. This is one way that you might answer this part of the question. So please, again, follow along with the chart itself. Judge the accuracy of the ideas presented, and I'm hoping you'll have some ideas about the type of information that you might include in your own practice questions. So let's listen now to the second part. The number of visitors to Canada during these 3 years increased overall, regardless of the method of travel. For example, travel by air increased by 700,000, beginning with 3.8 million visitors in 2013 and reaching 4.5 million by 2016. The number of travelers who entered by land had a less significant increase, but nonetheless, drivers accounted for close to 1 million visitors in 2016, up overall from 600,000 just 3 years earlier. Travel by boat contributed to the fewest number of non-resident travelers, with only 300,000 people crossing the ocean in 2016. But this number rose slightly from 100,000 visitors who arrived by sea in 2013. Okay, so again, let's just have a quick look at the transcript. So remember, we wanted to start with an overall trend, and we noticed the similarity that pretty much every method of transportation depicted here did show an increase. So we state that first, and then we just throw in a little transition here. So for example, and then we get into a ton of specific details that come from the chart itself. So again, just having a quick skim through this, you can see all of the numbers and sometimes the years as well that we're interpreting from. So keep an eye on your time. You don't want to spend all of your time reading out every single detail because you still have other parts of the question to answer. This part will likely take up a large chunk of your time. I think a good minute or so of your talk time will be spent interpreting some of these trends. Now, so far in this part of the recording anyways that you've just heard, we haven't done a lot of comparison contrast. And the reason for that is because sometimes it's easiest to save the comparison contrast pieces for the conclusions that you're being asked to draw. So this is the third and final part of the question instructions that we'll be covering. So when we draw conclusions, what we're doing is we're suggesting some logical ideas or making some logical assumptions as to why this information is the way it is. So again, comparing and contrasting. Clearly, we can see here that airplane travel represents by far the most significant method of travel. So you want to start asking yourself why. Once you explain that in your answer, suggest a reason why airplane travel would be the most popular. In contrast, I guess you could look at why travel by sea is by far the least popular. Looking at similarities here in the chart, I noticed that both in the year 2013 to 2014, you can see that there was a noticeable dip there in transportation by the number of people who flew into the country or drove here. So again, once you point out that similarity, just take a moment to explain why that could be. Okay, so this is what we mean by drawing conclusions, always providing reasons that suggest why this information is the way it is. So once again, I'm going to play a clip here of a recording. You'll hear my voice again, trying to identify these similarities and conclusions and offering again some reasons why that might be the case. Despite the overall upward trend, the number of visitors traveling by air and by land dipped noticeably between 2013 and 2014. It is possible that the economy during this time was weaker, so visitors might not have been able to afford the trip. Travel rebounded during the next 2 years, however, suggesting that either the economy had stabilized or that only wealthier citizens were traveling. Air travel remains the most common method of transportation, likely because it is the fastest way to enter Canada. Crossing the ocean is time-consuming and has the potential to be dangerous or uncomfortable, given that storms and seasickness can occur. So it is not surprising that this method of travel is the least popular and that low numbers remain fairly consistent over the 3-year time period. All right, so again, let's have just a quick look here at the transcript. So what I'd like to point out is a pattern that works at least for this question, and you would likely be able to apply it to other graphs that you would be studying or encountering. So first of all, right in the top there, we'll go bit by bit. The red lines here represent the notice of the similarity. So here we're pointing out that here's the similarity between travel by land and by air in 2013 to 2014. Those numbers dipped. So we point that out first. This is an example of explaining the graph. So that would be step 2. The conclusion that we're drawing here, though, we're suggesting that maybe it had something to do with the economy and people just couldn't afford it. So that's the conclusion we're adding in to rationalize why this dip might have occurred. And then the next idea we present, we're just noticing right from the graph itself that the travel rebounded, meaning in the following year, the numbers started to rise again. So again, we're interpreting or explaining the graph, looking at that information. And once again, we give another conclusion why that could be. So we say, well, the economy may have stabilized or wealthier citizens themselves were traveling. So we actually have 2 conclusions or 2 ideas there that might explain why travel rebounded at that time. And we continue in this fashion. So this is an obvious one. Air travel was definitely the most popular method. So we would simply state that. Once again, we're explaining information from the graph. But again, the reason for that is, well, perhaps it's just because it's so fast to fly into the country. And then we almost contrast that against travel by sea. So if airplane travel is the fastest, you'll notice this time we're presenting the conclusion first. So we're suggesting that it just takes so long to cross the ocean by boat in comparison to flying to Canada. And then there's a secondary conclusion there. Might be a bit of a weaker idea, but it's logical to a point. We can talk about how, it can be more dangerous. There are storms, there's seasickness. So people would choose perhaps not to take a boat to Canada when they have the option of flying if they can afford it. So that's the point that we're trying to make there. And then last but not least, we finish actually with another idea. So it's not surprising that that method of travel is least popular and that low numbers are consistent over that time period on the chart as well. So again, now we're back to just explaining a fact or a detail from the chart as well that follows up with the conclusion that we've just made. So when you look at the number of conclusions that are included in this answer, I'd say there's at least 4 of them there, perhaps even 5 if you look at them closely. So again, you'll want to provide several conclusions. Again, please keep an eye on your time. If you're running short on time, you don't have to give 4 or 5 conclusions. You would do so only if you've got enough time to do so. Each question is a little bit different that way. But again, pace yourself. You definitely need to give some conclusions. So make sure that you've done that as well. Now, the final thing you're going to do, you've already described, you've explained, and you've drawn some conclusions. The very last thing you're going to do is offer a concluding statement. So you're just wrapping up what it was you were talking about. So any final statement usually either summarizes the main point that you made, or it might even predict a change. So in this case, I would probably actually predict. We can look at how the numbers here of travelers has increased in every method of transportation. So I would likely suggest that if these numbers have increased thus far, they will probably continue to increase. That just seems like a logical prediction to make. So we'll play now just the final statement. This is one sentence to predict these trends. So here it is. On this chart, it is probable that Canada will continue to welcome an increased number of visitors in future years. And that's it. One sentence will do it. So we can see that here. So it is probable. You can tell that we're predicting, Canada will continue to welcome. So it just sort of wraps it up. And you'll notice too that we ended by mentioning visitors to Canada. And that was the whole point of this entire graph. It goes back to the title. So we've sort of come full circle and referenced the topic of the entire chart, but again, given that prediction to move forward. So that's a decent way to end. So here's the transcript from start to finish. I know it looks like a lot. It is a 2-minute answer, almost exactly, right down to the second. It is 2 minutes long if you were to splice all of those 4 audio clips together that we just listened to. So we've already talked a lot about the content and the specific details. So I think that part we can understand, and that goes a long ways towards your score on the Cael test. I'd like to just do a very quick look at some of the language use involved here. So in red, you can see transitions, conjunctions that connect ideas together. So what's good about this is that there's a variety. We do have a few simple ideas like so and you'll use those anyways at some point. Those are probably some of the more common words in English, as a matter of fact. But when you're looking at the level of complexity here, I think we've got a decent showing. So words like nonetheless and despite and however and based on this chart and so on. So there's a pretty good variety. And again, we are creating an academic tone when we connect ideas together. So that part I think is quite strong. The vocabulary itself is also showing academic language and again accounts for a good variety. So when you do a very quick scan of this document, what you're also looking for too is to make sure that we haven't repeated the same words over and over. One of the challenges for this type of response is because we're talking about the number of travelers to Canada. You'll want to think of synonyms. We don't want to just say travelers over and over. So sometimes we say travelers, sometimes we say visitors, sometimes we might even say citizens. So again, as you're studying from home and then when you speak on the test itself, focus a lot of effort into creating these synonyms or paraphrased ideas so that you end up having a good variety of language there to show. All right, so I'm hoping that that approach gives you a few more ideas about how you might want to structure your responses when it comes time to speaking on a visual on the Cael test itself. So this episode actually concludes season 2 of our Cael prep series here on YouTube. We are going to take a little break and we will be back with more content later on in the summer 2021. If you'd like, you can subscribe for notifications so that you won't miss the next episode. But we will see you back after a short rest. Good luck with your studying and put all of these skills to good use.